All right, everybody. Oh, it's almost the week. So I'm going to light up the grill. We're going to get the fire started. It's time for a work session on the administration's org chart. Welcome, everybody. I'm calling to order this work session on AO 2024-350, which is a I'm wrong one. AR 2024-110S, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code chapters 1.35, 3.20, and 3.30 relating to the organization of the executive branch, setting forth the duties and responsibilities of executive branch agencies, amending related Anchorage Municipal Code to reflect the new executive management structure, and removing gendered language. We'll start with introductions. Mr. Williams.
Daniel Volin.
Karen Bronga.
Mark Littlefield.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawl.
Zach Johnson. Christopher Constant.
Exalted.
On the phone, we have Mr. Martinez. You there?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. We are also joined by the municipal manager, chief administrative officer, and the mayor. So I guess we'll start with the preface by the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks everybody for meeting today to go over the proposed org chart. So I want to start by saying that the org chart represents our commitment as an administration to good government. And since day one, we have been focused on building a strong team to tackle not just the operational challenges the municipality faces, but also to move forward on big priorities at the same time. And the org chart is our internal structure for getting things done and serving the people of Anchorage. This org chart presented to you in the original version maintains a baseline of consistency along with a few key changes. Like one, the municipal manager and chief administrative officer, the CAO, do you have a nickname? Cow. We might work on that. The CAO role has existed in the past. It's not a new role. And the purpose of this structure is to split the internal facing service departments like finance, HR, IT, purchasing from the community facing departments like APD, the health department, fire, parks and rec, et cetera. And it provides for a strategic approach to those internal facing service departments. And it enables us to have two dynamic leaders in these two roles and achieve an effective structure where we can multiply what we get done. We've already seen some examples of the power of this model in practice, whether we're talking about the port or our response to homelessness. Two, there's a shift from community and economic development to a new department called Planning, Development, and Public Works. And this is simply to reflect the work that is being done in that column under the municipal manager. The third area of change, the Office of Equity and Justice has been renamed to the Office of Equity and Inclusion to better reflect the department's non-legal mission. Having justice in the name prompted a number of law-related inquiries, hence the change. We're also engaged in ongoing work with assembly members to make it so that the director of the office does not just serve at the pleasure of the mayor, and which was the original intent of the code that was approved by this body. So I'm proud of this team. I'm excited about the structure that we have in place and look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fossey.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to set the table for conversation, I think we're mostly here to answer any questions that we hear from the Assembly, but to give you a brief way into all of this, we did want to put on the big board Assembly Ordinance 2024-110, and the main, which is about the reorganization of the executive branch. And I think the main thing we're going to do is leave our proposed org chart up on the board and then have a conversation about that. But just so you can see how we came to the thinking that we landed on, and because I can't help myself and I want to show you some history that I have found, and because Daryl Hess is in the audience, I'm going to need a quick whirlwind tour. What the punchline is, the municipality has been reorganized a lot and in a lot of different forms. And as the mayor said, we are excavating some oldies but goodies. So I got just a few slides where I'll walk through and show you. Here's what the municipal organization looked like in 1978. This is pretty different from things that we have seen in recent times. Then in 1980, we have this model, which is, like, as I've told some others, George Sullivan's oldie but goodie. The municipal manager has these two peer organizations, which are each headed by a different chief administrative officer. There, the internal services departments actually are held by the municipal manager, and the external ones are held by different versions of the chief administrative officer. As the experiments continue, in 1983, we have Commissioner Gordon, like from Batman fame. The public safety commissioner is now on the org chart. And now we no longer have chief administrative officers. Now we have executive managers, and some of them are public utility focused. Some of them are public services focused. Winding the clock forward, 1989, we again go back to having an executive manager for management services. And I flag this one only because this is pretty similar to what we're proposing, although different title. We're going with the chief administrative officer label rather than the executive manager label. But here in 1989, the executive manager had HR, the version of IT, purchasing, and at that point, OMB was not a direct mayoral report. You'll see that as time goes on, the mayoral reports do change a lot. By 1996, HR is going straight to the mayor and not through a manager. And now we're experimenting in a structure where the manager has different layers of reports reporting to him or her. It was a him at this point, but Tony Knowles had a her. Winding the clock a little bit forward again, in 1999, we were back to having an executive manager that again is looking more and more closer to what we have going on, where finance and IT and purchasing are reporting to the executive manager. They also have property and facilities management, something that doesn't quite exist in the current org chart and hasn't recently. And then some early version of planning development or community economic development is now starting to show up as the innovations continue. By 2003, we're starting to settle into things that look a little bit more modern, but here we have that org chart was simplified. And so now just about everything has gone back to the municipal manager, except all the enterprise activities are split off. Then by 2004, we have the first instance of the Office of Economic and Community Development, which hadn't existed before then. And I believe this is also the first org chart, unless it was the last one and I missed it, that the CFO finally appears somewhere on the chart. For a long time, up until this moment, the CFO was just the head of the finance department, which either reported to the municipal manager or to one of those executive managers or to the chief administrative officer. By 2009, the Office of Economic Community Development is expanding, and there has been no settled portfolio there in this iteration. The port is part of the Office of Economic and Community Development. 2010, further iterations. I'm not sure there's anything that's too worth flagging on this one. And then getting much more close to modern times, 2020, again, lots of free play. Here, the Information Technology Office is now reporting directly to the mayor. For those who were here then, that's largely a function of SAP being such a high focus of activity at the time. I think the lesson there is often the org chart seems to be changing in response to whatever the conditions of the day are. And that may be part of our punchline. This was the org chart that we inherited, the one that you were familiar with from the tail end of the prior administration. I think a key feature of this one is that just about everything was going to the municipal manager. I'll say, as a former municipal manager, I would have some span of control concerns about that. I think that may just actually be too big a bite, but perhaps that's other people's mileage may vary. So finally, we land here at what we have proposed in AO 2024-110, and I'll pass it over to Manager Wynn Pearson to give us some color commentary on the thinking behind this.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey, and I really have very little to add other than to just reiterate both the mayor's points and the punchline there, which is that I know you all lived through the last several years. We have all read the same transition reports and walked through the same issues, and we've seen that there are challenges facing both the internal services that the municipality currently provides to itself in order to make our externally facing departments work, and also challenges in our externally facing departments and how we offer the services that we offer to our community. And so in looking at this, we borrowed from the past, as Mr. Falsey has walked us through, and also from practices that are common in industry. I know I mentioned in my confirmation hearing that I came to this role from being the chief administrative officer at GCI, the state's largest telecommunications carrier, where we took the same model. We had one executive in charge of our internally facing services and departments that serve the company itself, and another in charge of the operating and sales verticals of the company. So I think this is a familiar structure to address an enterprise where there are needs in that internally facing structure and needs in the externally facing structure. And we're pleased to present it for review as our proposal for how we hope to move forward in service to the people of Anchorage. So thank you.
So I have my first question, then I have Ms. Briley, then Mr. Boland. I'm sure there'll be a number of questions on Ms. Alto. So I'm looking at that, and I looked at all of them. It's a very interesting trip down memory lane, all of those different org charts. So what is the theory on how the assembly relates to the department heads just from this picture?
Or do you want to take it? Sure. I mean, I think to me, the theory on relation to department heads is not necessarily org chart contingent, but sort of philosophy and relationship contingent as between the branches of government. I know we've talked a bit about this, and my approach is that I think that the assembly should interface directly with the directors of departments. I know you have, of the past several years, done considerable work to create a committee structure that allows each department to have direct oversight and interface with the body in terms of each department's priorities. And so I'm not sure that that necessarily is altered specifically by the structure of the org chart itself, but rather just by, I think, the relationship between the bodies. And I think our philosophy is openness, and that there should be, again, connection and collaboration between the branches of government in terms of helping to support the operational departments and to provide priorities and direction to those departments.
So the last time an org chart was formalized, because of a placement of a position in the org chart, a lawsuit occurred, and the assembly lost that lawsuit because of the structure of the org chart. And so just making a presumption that a philosophy or an approach is a thing, I don't think actually achieves the policy goal of ensuring that the assembly does have that right that I believe exists inherent in our charter to have the relationships. And the one that, of course, that jumps out the most to me is the municipal attorney. The attorneys advise the assembly directly, but from the looks of this, it feels very much exactly like the Bronson administration's approach, which was the municipal attorney actually, in fact, worked against the assembly very directly and very aggressively with the mayor to make major abuses occur. Just the first one that comes to mind is the tent and the Hickle construction contract, and the second one is a Klutna. And so from that snapshot, it appears that the municipal attorney, as an example, has no connection to the assembly. And so this could flow. OMB is another big one where we have a very strong association with because of our fiduciary responsibilities. And so if you look at it just as supervision, that's one thing. But if you look at it as relationships to departments, that's another thing. And so the question I have is not one we'll probably answer here today, but how can we reflect visually that philosophy? And so that's what I have a kind of an underpinning question.
It's a good question. And to the chair, I would say the image certainly doesn't override the charter, which is very specific about the duties of the municipal attorney. I know you know that. I know that other administrations may have interpreted that differently, but the charter, our interpretation is very clear that the municipal attorney is counsel to the municipality as a whole, to both branches of government equally. And so how that is reflected in the image itself, we could certainly take offline and discuss further. I think but I just want to make clear that our interpretation is certainly not that however this picture is drawn in any way impinges upon the language of the charter, which is very clear about the dual role of the municipal attorney. And certainly happy to discuss.
So, yeah, I hope to do that. If you go back to the slide that was before 1989, I didn't catch the year.
I should say for anyone who really wants to retrace all this history, all of these are in the budgets. So you can fish out every different organizational chart since the very beginning from looking at the budgets. And I high graded the ones which were big changes, but I do have all of them if anyone wants them.
Yeah, very interesting. So I think this one at least implies that there is a connection between the department heads and branches, because the dash lines don't only go to boards and commissions, clerk, ombudsman, internal audit, or the other one is the attorney. There's that dashed line that connects to the various department heads to the right that are directly full solid line, the municipal attorney to the mayor, right? So this one at least reflected some kind of a connection to the various department heads. And so that I think is the closest that I've seen in all of those that were presented to get closer to an actual reflection of our organization.
I'm laughing only because this one puzzles me. I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out like who the what ones floating on the right actually reported to. But again, I'm happy to discuss the graphic. offline.
And I think it's just that little dashed line that you could draw from the assembly down the solid line across through, which is weird, the boards and commissions, or through that dash line. It's that 2-inch dash line there that it's not the org chart as a whole. I really appreciate your org chart as it stands because it does clearly communicate, but for one piece of info. Okay, so we'll take that up separately. I have a number of people in the queue. I think I made my point. Ms. Brawley.
Thanks. And I appreciate the look back. I spotted very briefly Department of Neighborhoods that used to exist. Not we're going to bring that back. Just want to flag that. My question is around the administrative officer. So I know you guys have been characterizing, and it makes sense, the internal departments versus external, but I guess I still see there's some big policy questions that we're going to be looking at. And I do think that there's, the I-team, for example, not so much policy questions there, but they're internal in the sense that they're producing things for other departments. But really, a lot of what the work that they do is communicating with the public, essentially. So I just want to note there's a nexus there, and it's not quite as clean. But more specifically, I'm looking at the venues, which I understand is really managing contracts with those. So again, there's this internal facing administrative piece. But also, I think there's going to be some significant policy discussion about things that touch those. And so I bring that up. And again, I think to get a variation of Mr. Constance's question, how do you imagine this team making kind of policy calls and really working? Because again, there's the external facing, there's the operations part of it, but really trying to understand how the management structure fits with kind of the who's at the table with decision making, and kind of how we work through some of those policy discussions. And I guess where I'm going is, do we always CC both of you on every email that's related to every policy question? Or right, I mean, I think it's it gets a little bit messier than the characterization from operations perspective. And again, I'm saying this because I know 2025 there's going to be some big discussions in that area. So I'm interested in that as well.
Through the chair, Member Brawley, it's also a good question. I think that a couple things. I mean, clearly it's not an absolutely perfect, rule with no wiggle room to it. Like when I was at GCI and I was the CAO, I was in charge of communications, which is indisputably an externally facing and also internally facing function, but it aligned with what was the rest of the things that were in my column. And so certainly there's a little bit of wiggle room to each of these things. I would say it is certainly not bad practice to CC both of us on many things, because many things will have us collaborating. But I think the real answer is that internally, and I think this structure will help us to break down some of the silos that we have. Like basically every major policy priority that we're working on is going to require cross-functional collaboration from a variety of teams to be done effectively. And so we are working internally to build out who is going to be, and to identify who's our lead in building out each of these cross-functional teams, so that we can be clear and clearly communicate about who has accountability for each task, both internally and also externally. But I think that's part of how we solve problems, is going to be in that intersection, which is not always going. So there'll be a little bit of messiness in that, but I think it is a necessary part of problem solving. And we will endeavor over time to be very clear about who is the lead internally from the administration about different specific policy priorities, and working groups to, again, help facilitate that transparency. That answers.
Yeah, thanks. And just a very brief follow-up comment too. Hopefully, I mean, I understand, again, this is the organization chart, but I think also it would be helpful to have an ongoing discussion and make some kind of calls about kind of how the executive branch structure also interacts with the assembly. So our committees, liaisons that we have specific, right? So I think there's still some kind of stitching together work to be done there. So I just wanted to mention that it's kind of outside the scope of just the org chart, but in terms of making policy calls, I see that as something we can improve. Thanks.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I wanted to mention too, from my perspective, this is largely showing the reporting structure. And, if it would be helpful to mapping out comms or to mapping out other things, I mean, that's definitely something we could do. But, the structure of it with the 3 in the middle there, in particular shows that we don't take any action in terms of separating individuals, who are directors of those positions without concurrence from the assembly, whereas all those other positions are different. So from my vantage point, this is largely organizational and mapping out reporting structures. But again, happy to work on other flowcharts or depictions that could further flesh out some of those nuances and communications too.
All right, so a little bit of work in progress then. I think the response, Mr. Bullard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think the members from North Anchorage are definitely on the same wavelength today. Chris kind of stole my primary topic out of my brain, which was in regards to the municipal attorney. It's interesting to look at this and also think about how the assembly has evolved, the legislative branch over time. One thing I do really appreciate about this graphic representation is that it has the people of Anchorage at the top. That's ultimately who we all serve. And then we have the co-equal branches, the mayor and the assembly, or the executive branch and the assembly. I've had, I think, very well-intended a former assembly member tell me, well, why do you have assembly council? There's already a municipal attorney. Why do you guys need your own lawyers? And I think that this, to me, does drive that point home, even though the municipal attorney does give us very valuable advice. And I think we have a great one right now. I think that there is, I guess, still a little bit of sort of misunderstanding sometimes, or just maybe lack of education about how our branch has evolved and why we need the support that we need. And so I wonder, well, first, I guess I don't know, do we have, Chair, our own org chart for the legislative branch in a graphic representation like this?
Yeah, we do have a version, but it's not part of this ordinance. There's no
Right.
change to it.
Right.
And it's not set out, so.
I think, and I know this is not the intent of this ordinance, but I think it might also be helpful for the public to have sort of a master graph that also has our branch on it. And so they can see how the different branches function in tandem and who reports to who. And yeah, I think why it's important that our branch also has a line of report and has the very valuable staff that supports us. Thanks.
Right, Ms. Salta.
Thanks. So you have an S version on the table as well. I had some opportunity to work with the municipal attorney about the Office of Equity and Inclusion. It sits, as you see here on the chart, in between the two branches of government, just like internal audit. What I did was made the language mirror a little bit more like what internal audit says. And if you want that for reference, it's 3.20.100. And what it does is in the established clause of the auditor, it mentions both the assembly and the mayor's office. And that's absolutely what I did here with the Office of Equity and Inclusion. And then it just has a purpose statement, like how do you work with the two branches of government to do what? And then everything else is pretty much the same, is the same. It's still the duties as proposed by the administration. The reason I did that is if our intention is to have these roles sit in between the branches of government, I think it's important that our code shows and reflects how we've done that consistently. So it's really a cleanup idea of how we do it and consistently. I think it's also more explicit based on some of the lessons learned in the past administration about what that office did and where it sat. So that's what the S version does.
Mr. Chair, I might add to that just by drawing the Assembly's attention to page 3 of both the S version and the originally introduced version. The Office of Equity and Justice today lives in a different number of different code provisions, but one of them was it was in the long list of 32070, which is all labeled executive branch organization. And there's another cross-reference in the provision that doesn't show up here that says within the office of the mayor is everything in 32070. That was something that came up in that lawsuit. So one of the things we were trying to do in this ordinance was to pull the Office of Equity and Justice completely out of that list. So it's no longer formally or accidentally within the office of the mayor.
Other questions, inputs? Ms. Alto.
Sorry, I had one more that had nothing to do with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, which is where is the deputy municipal manager in all of this? Not often reflected in the org chart, but as we have a new deputy municipal manager, there's usually a portfolio that goes along with that position, and I'm kind of curious.
Also a good question. And so, yeah, I'm told that the deputy municipal manager does not usually live in the org chart. So that's why that role is not depicted here. But Mr. Spafford is on board, and his portfolio is Anchorage Hydropower, Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility, the municipal airports, solid waste services, safety, and public transportation.
Public transportation being people mover. you mean?
Correct. Well, and also the various other services provided by public transportation. Yeah. Anchor rides, everything
Anchor-
else. in the
all
public
of those,
transportation
but
department.
you don't
Yeah.
mean like Public Works or any of
No,
those
no, no. I
pieces.
mean,
Okay,
the department that is referred to as public transportation in the code. Yeah.
missed its box.
Which
Okay,
is people
thanks.
mover and et cetera. Yeah. Safety is a division of the municipal manager. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just chewing on that. Go ahead, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to Mr. Volan's point, we had an earlier draft that had clerk, ombudsman, elections, legislative services, assembly council in there. I know through this process, it doesn't look like it from, the outcome here with all the different departments. There was an effort to try to streamline because the reality is, org charts are always confusing for the public. And I'll be honest, I couldn't tell you as an assembly member, if someone had asked me, draw the org chart of the current administration, because at the end of the day, that's not what drives communications, or for, at least for us and other administrations, another administration they worked with, that's not what drove it. So I do want to stress that, again, this isn't mapping out communications or relationships, but it is about reporting structure. And so the municipal attorney, as the municipal manager said, that relationship or that role is in charter. But I think too, to that other example, Mr. Chair, that you had pointed to, the dotted line stopped and became a solid line. And I think that's a little bit confusing too. But all that to say, yeah, if I see the point about adding those other departments within the legislative branch. And again, just really want to stress, this is about reporting structure. It is not intended to be any kind of prescriptive guide about relationships or communications or comment on availability of the municipal attorney. Thanks.
And on that front, Mr. Chair, I'll also say, just to remind everybody, this particular image goes with page 2, and it lives in the code provision 32010, which starts with the executive branch of the municipal government shall be organized as provided in the following plan. So there's no harm at all in expanding to show the assembly side, but I think just formally we're amending Title 3. You guys live in Title 2. If you wanted to have a version of your org chart in Title 2 that just had a little mayor box, I think we wouldn't take offense at that.
So the clerk has suggested that there is an org chart at 2.20.045 in our section of the code. And so that just still doesn't really get to a satisfying answer, I don't think. Because I agree with all of that, but that's not what the takeaway is from this visually. The takeaway is this is the executive order. And when you then say it is, as Bill just said, 3.20.10, it's tied to that exactly, then that it kind of, I think, concretizes it more firmly, kind of binds the structure to, this is how this organization works. And again, the confounding one of them all the most is the attorney, but, so I have to chew on this just a little bit more. And if there were some kind of a statement overtly that said, this is the reporting structure, like the supervisory reporting structure, maybe that gets to clarity, but there's just a little bit more gray in reality than what's here. And
Yeah.
so, go ahead.
Oh, just in response to that, I know that there's only so much work that the visual can do. I will say maybe it doesn't get you all the way there, but the provision that addresses the municipal attorney on page 3 does name check the requirement of the charter that the municipal attorney is responsible for providing legal services to the whole of the municipal government. And then we can continue to have the provision that was recently added on page 8 and 9, which is now subsection F, which sort of generally says, in addition to all their other functions and responsibilities, it's a function and responsibility of each department in this whole section to provide reasonable and customary necessary municipal services and to support the assembly and the legislative branch departments to enable you guys to do your
Again,
functions.
so that then, in my opinion, or my theory of visually representing what the code says, there's some way to demarcate what that language is into the visual is valuable, because I will tell you, 9 out of 10 people aren't going to read section 3.20, but they are going to look at the picture, and the picture is going to be the thing that drives most people who are inquiring about what's the structure, how does that work, and then the subsection that says, and you are prudent, reasonable, providing services. It's a dash line. However it gets there, I'm not sure how or where, but it's like a dash line. Thank you, Ms. Sato.
Thanks. So I want to get away from the visual for a minute and back to the Office of Equity and Inclusion. So this is a heck of a list of things to do. The work plan for the Office of Equity and Inclusion is really, really big. There's a lot of shalls in there. And I think it's important. I think the overall structure of the big picture questions we want the Office of Equity and Inclusion to look at are really big and important. But then we also added a bunch of things to this office that I'm worried we didn't adequately resource, and might take away from the big picture hard work that I think needs to be done. And so I know we appropriated through an amendment a little bit more resources there, but I'm hoping that as this gets solidified into code with more specificity, we can have that capacity conversation, because I think everyone, the public I've talked to about the Office of Equity and Inclusion is excited and feels like it's a re-energized office. Once this is there, this kind of sets that work plan. But I don't want to set it up to not have the capacity to actually carry it out, whether through working with contractors or additional staffing. As I look at this office and everything happening, and then the chief administrative officer's section of code is just about as long. But what I know is there are people and departments in buttressing it. And so just something to think about. I've been thinking a lot about that, especially as we put EEO in there, language access plan, putting action behind the affirmative action plan. Each and every one of those things could be a job in and of itself. And we really have a person, well, 2 people and maybe a half. So thank you.
So I promise I wasn't mad dogging Miss Bronco. I was squinting my eyes as I was staring right over her head.
Thank God I'm looking.
No, it wasn't. But you have the floor.
Okay, so in response to what Member Zolotel just said, it looked like in the B section of here, the Office of Equity and Inclusion shall have such assistants and employees as are necessary to perform all duties. So maybe that helps.
Our budget certainly didn't do that, I don't think.
Okay,
I mean, and I think that's important when we tie these 2 things together. This is why they kind of run at the same time.
and then what I really wanted to ask though is, so you may have said this at the beginning and I apologize if I got lost, but most of these flow charts always have the CFO somewhere. And so that would just be where the finance tab is. And to me, it would be helpful to have CFO right there. I don't know. You maybe tell me
Yeah.
why it's not there.
Through the chair to member Bronga, until I think it's 2004, the CFO was never on the org chart. And so the proposal here is to return us to the pre-2004 arrangement where the CFO is the director of the finance department. Behind the curtain, actually, once the CFO was listed on the org chart, the CFO had a very small budgetary appropriation, and then the finance department was comprised of the 4 divisions: public finance, the assessor's office, the controller's office, and treasury. And there was no director of the finance department, at least for budget purposes. So there's a strange gap. And so we just sort of put it back the way it used to be.
So the other thing, if I looked at what this flow chart looked like previously, some of these yellow tabs are identical, I think. I mean, it kind of looked like it. And then it says those are notable divisions. So under finance or under real estate, Heritage Land Bank was there, real estate services. So what is the notable division if that's been where it was previously?
So through the chair to member Bronga, I don't believe that this org chart creates any new notable divisions. I think it moves some of the notable divisions around, and it rebrands one of the notable divisions. Sorry, that's not quite true. It rebrands one notable division, the Office of Federal Compliance, and it newly anticipates a grant development office as a subcomponent of the chief administrative officer. But as to generally, why are they notable? I think that's just been a lived experience that is a big function that has not been at the department level, but that is worth calling out on the org chart itself.
Where are the grants going to be again?
In the chief administrative officer office.
And I would offer if we wanted to, and we don't want to, but for parallel purposes under APD, you could put in the various units, you could put in the mobile crisis team as these yellow boxes, not necessarily, these other ones I think really are the ones that kind of are always popping out as a substantial subdivision within the operation that is warranted of its own reflection on the chart. I think would be a fair way to put that. Anyone else? So I don't think at this point there were any impulses towards major change proposals. On your very second slide with the red line under executive branch organization, I almost read that a little bit as a, hey, you guys stay out of our lane. But then I, had another thought to that. This is the Assembly's concurrence to the executive branch administration, right? That's the subtle variation of where my mind went. I've been conditioned over the years to have to deal with that kind of thinking. Anyhow, so without any proposals hearing for a major change, I think there's just some marginal improvements. Mary, you want to speak to anything in conclusion before we wrap up?
Just thank you all for your time today and the discussion, and just, again, want to reiterate that this is a reporting structure depiction, and again, not intending to convey any limitations on relationships or communications, and certainly open to other depictions that could illustrate how a open, transparent approach might be mapped on a flow chart as a separate graphic, perhaps. Thanks.
I know that face. All right, everybody. Any last questions, comments, or concerns? I don't think we have any other business for the remainder of this week, so everybody, we'll see you next week.